Hello everybody and welcome to this Images special. It's not the normal 6, there's quite a few more than that this time. This is because it's about the Hawker Hunter, an aircraft that was much loved by Dave Linney and Rick Lee, and it came up in the conversations I had with them on both their podcasts. We're going to start with the first picture, which I simply described as beautiful, and also I know that they both love the aircraft because its handling qualities, and it was a very capable aircraft. So over to them.
I think Keith is absolutely correct. It's one of the most beautiful aeroplanes ever designed, and it was the one aeroplane that came in 1954. I think it first became operational. My dad talked about them from when I was 10 until I joined the Air Force in 1962. He was in charge of all the spares for them at RAF Stafford, and he'd come home and complain vehemently about this new fighter that came in to replace the Meteors and Vampires. But there were so many problems that they had, and they had all these modifications, and 30 years later we came to Australia, and he sat in one, and I was flying then Hunters privately owned in Australia in 2008, 2009. And my father in his mid-80s got in the cockpit, and he could still remember all the modifications that were done to that aeroplane.
Even then?
In the late 80s and 60s. He could touch every single one of the weapon switches and remember which mod it was. Quite remarkable. So I was brought up with the Hawker Hunter, and it was in 1958 we got, as an ATC cadet, I watched 22 of them loop at Farnborough, and a guy go up to 25,000 feet and spin it, and we all, thousands of people, all counted the number of turns as he span down towards the crowd and then came out and whizzed across the field. So the Hunter was my dream aeroplane, and I had a little model, a 72nd model on the front of my little Ford car, which I painted silver so it looked like a Rolls Royce thing at the front. And I drove around in that. So it was my dream aeroplane, and it turned out to be the one aeroplane which taught all fighter pilots how to stick, search and report. We had to undo our straps slightly and take them off our shoulders to look backwards, and combating was magic. There were so many aeroplanes that would fall foul in training to its 4 Aden cannons, and even on all the exercises with Fradu many years later with Dave here, we would combat with all sorts of aeroplanes. We're talking about Tornadoes, Buccaneers, Harriers.
And it stood up well to all of them.
And it did. It was a great combat aeroplane to learn.
And obviously you, Dave, with your first model, isn't it? So
yeah, indeed.
This is deep-rooted, isn't it?
Well,
going back in
me
time.
As a kid. Yeah.
Brilliant. Right, so we go on to the next picture.
Yeah,
which
Dave
is
could talk about that.
two Hunters and a Canberra, isn't it?
Yeah, this was it first or second Gulf War, Rick?
I think it was...
Must have been the first Gulf War.
Yeah,
it was. First Gulf War. And we were being tasked with training the ships as they went through the Med towards the war zone. Normal sort of training, against sea-skim missiles and all that sort of stuff. And we went in hops. We started off in Gibraltar, wasn't it? And we did a bit of work off Gib. Porto?
We went into Porto, didn't we? And Nice, and then Gib. I'm not sure.
Yeah, but we didn't work with the ships until we got to Gib.
Oh, that's correct. That's correct. Yeah.
So we were working with the ships off Gib for a while, and then as they moved further along, we leapfrogged up to Decci Momano in Sardinia, and we operated out of there for a short while. And as they got nearer to the east end of the Med, we hopped over to Rhodes. I think we were there for about 2 weeks, weren't we?
Yeah, Rhodes.
We did a lot of work out of Rhodes. And it was great fun. We had, as you can see in the photograph, we had one Canberra, which I think John Whitehead was flying, if I remember rightly, and a couple of Hunters. I think I was in the single-seater. Were you in the two-seater?
We had 4 Hunters.
We had 4 altogether.
And a Canberra. and I was in the single-seater that took that coloured picture, and I think I took that one as well.
Yeah.
So what do they use the camera for then in that role? Was that, what was it taking photographs? Was it?
Well, they used it mainly then. It was being used as a target tower.
Just a target tower, right.
And they'd haul targets for the ship's missiles and gun systems to shoot at. Good fun.
It's a good one, that.
I remember one day we were operating out of Rhodes and talking to the radar controller, and he said, "There's a pair of aircraft just come off the coast at Libya, very high speed, heading towards you." And I thought, "Ugh!" And of course we weren't armed. We didn't have any weapons, any armed guns or anything. So we turned away just in case, and luckily he turned back. But I don't know what it was, but it was going very fast.
Going out to the Gulf War, Mr. America was passing over our heads with streams of aeroplane, taking all the stuff into the Middle East, and all the naval ships, the American Navy, of course, were moving down the Med and into the Channel and into the Red Sea, into the Suez Canal. And I went out on a sortie with John Barrow to intercept one of our boats, and we might have got a little lost, but we had this radio call from an American ship saying, "Aeroplanes approaching, you're approaching an American fleet, you will be shot down if you do not turn away." And I remember Dave and I looking at one another and doing a quick 180 and getting away, because they were really
trigger happy.
Trigger happy.
Right.
So the poor little hunter.
They always are, the Americans. They don't like you flying near their boats unless...
I found that in
I
Oman
call them
as
boats because it annoys them.
There you go.
Right, so moving on to the next one, which is one of yours, Rick, I think.
Oh, wow.
With
yes. Okay. It's
the
a
teeth.
picture, it says on it August the 7th, 2008, Oakey, Rockhampton, which is in Australia, with a chap called Jeff Mosca. And it's a Singaporean F-75 with teeth on it. I think they look awful on a Hunter, but anyway. And it's got 4 jugs on it. It's a 2-seater. And a guy bought 20 Hawker Hunters off the Australian Air Force.
It's amazing, isn't it?
And for about, I think it was 500,000 Australian dollars. He got them a real bargain. And he took them apart. He was told to take them apart before they left the island, shipped them to Darwin in crates, put them together again after putting them on a truck and taking them down to a place called Tookumwal. Sounds like something out of Middle East and America. But Tookumwal is an airfield down in the south of Australia. And he put them in the hangar, and over the next 5 or 6 years he put them together and we flew them. I was just sort of...
How many were flying? Did you get flying?
I flew about 4 or 5 of them, delivered them to various people who could afford them. And this particular shot of the 2-seater was the one time with Jeffrey Mosca, who was basically a guy in his late 30s, early 40s. He had a business buying second-hand tow trucks from all around the Middle East and the Far East, painting them up, redoing them, and then renting them to the airlines in Sydney and Brisbane and Melbourne. And he made a fortune.
Enterprising.
But he's flying in this aeroplane with me. We flew quite some distance, about an hour or so sortie, out up to this place in Rockhampton, strapped him in and off he went. And that was the one trip he had.
Were there live bag seats in them, Rick? Or were you allowed
Good question, David. And it's something which my wife was very upset about, and people at the time thought I was stupid to fly these aeroplanes without ejection seats that worked. Now, one could say that we don't have ejection seats on airliners or any other aeroplanes, but to fly the Hunter without the ejection seat working was something I didn't want to do initially. But when we looked at the finances to get these aeroplanes airborne and sell them and move them around the place, Martin Baker, who I thought I had a good sort of in with because I've used their ejection seats, they charge an incredible amount for just 2 or 3 ejection cartridges. They have this amazing 65% destruction to get the ones that they want on each, and it was going to be incredibly expensive, more expensive than actually putting an airplane in the air almost. and I made the decision that whenever I flew, I always had a parachute. Okay, if you have an aileron jams on you and you jump out, as I did with Dave Linney doing combat some years later, there's not much you can do about it because you wouldn't get out. But wherever I flew in Australia, and I had the people in air traffic control to make absolutely certain, and the government, that wherever I went, I had the opportunity either to turn back and land or go into an area of Australia where I was not near the public, and I religiously stuck to that. So apart from a complete control failure just after takeoff, the chances of actually not being able to get out or climb high and do that, I was never flying very low level. I was always high level, which gave me the opportunity to jump out. And I actually took them at one particular flight for over 2 hours at high level from northern Queensland all the way down to Melbourne, a 2-hour flight, 10-minute flight to an air show. Yeah, so I did fly them without ejection seats.
All right.
Working.
Brave man.
Right, so the next pictures I'm going to go for are these 3 ones with ships.
Oh, yeah.
Which I'm curious about the story behind those. So what's the story of them then, Rick?
Can I have them over here? Yep, okay. These were taken when I was on 234 Squadron as an instructor in the 74 to 76. And one of the jollies at Broady was not just flying with senior officers who were coming out of the head shed and going back to lead squadrons, or young students learning how to do combat and drop weapons, was you take a couple of aeroplanes, sometimes up to 4 aeroplanes, down to Gibraltar. And while we were there, we were given jobs to look at the Russian Navy coming in from the Gulf of, what's it called? Well, basically the Atlantic, coming into the Gulf before Gibraltar. And they'd get warning from obviously some satellite systems that they were coming in. And we were tasked to take pictures of various vessels. Now in the Mediterranean, the Russians had 2 refueling points, Al Ojima and another one off the North Shore, one off the south of Spain, another one just off North Africa. And all the warships, the Kashinas, the Krivaks and the Crestas would come in from their journeys up and down the Med and into the Atlantic through the Gibraltar Straits and refuel. And the picture of the 296, I think it's a Krivak, is taken from me flying along with a number 2 on my right, taken from a side facer. What you did was you ran your right hand 230-gallon drop tank along just underneath the boat and pressed the trigger, and that's the picture you got. These pictures were unloaded and taken back to Gibraltar, and they'd be looked over very, very closely by our people in Gib. On one day, halfway along one of these ships, there was a man spread-eagled against, round about where the front funnel is, on one of those steel bulkheads. I didn't spot it at the time, but the photographer called me in and he said, "Rick, look at this," and he put a magnifying glass, and for 2 days this guy was spread-eagled naked on that one of those metal bulkheads,
right,
in the heat. He was there for about 2 days and then they took him down. So
that's charming.
The next one is of other Russian sailors which had been on a Foxtrot, which is I'm just looking at them two now, wondering whether they're both the same. I think they are, but anyway, they were coming in again and they'd heard that one had caught fire and it had surfaced, and some spy aeroplane from America had picked it up, and they informed us, and I was sent out to take a picture of this Foxtrot. They had a fire and they were all standing up on the deck, and you could actually see, or I couldn't make it out, but where it had heated and the fire inside had caused stuff, and there was smoke coming out of it when it came through a little bit.
So they were probably on parade because they'd heard you were coming.
Oh yes, but the amazing thing was when the vessels were okay, and not particularly that submarine. They had a bad time, obviously, poor guys. But when these big warships came through, and aircraft carriers, because I also took a picture of their Moskva when they had these vertical Harrier type things, Dave, taking off. I took some pictures of those, which was quite funny. And everybody was very interested because we had the Americans, of course, were there with their reconnaissance aeroplanes. And I remember one day I was in a Hunter, and this beautiful American swept wing, what's the name of that naval one with all the cameras on it? I'll think of it in a minute. And that went underneath me, supersonic, going down the Med, and I managed to be chasing it. Anyway, yeah, so the Americans were there as well. They were very keen, but we had our own little spy base. Very good.
Yeah, interesting pictures, those. Definitely.
They were quite aggressive. I remember going past one Cresta to take a picture of it. It was right next to the rock. I'd just taken off and I leveled my wings and came around, and he fired a Very at me, red Very. I wasn't that close. I was the right distance out with my tank and everything, but they were quite aggressive.
Yeah. So the next one is a private.
My job when I joined Fradu. They said, we'll give you the job to fly Hunters if you go to Chile and become a simulator instructor. And I said, what? So I was blackmailed into the job, but I'd already done simulator work with Lightnings. I was a simulator instructor on Lightnings, and also with Australians. I'd done various things at Boscombe Down with flick cards and things. So anyway, I said yes, it was in my CV. So he said, well, we can't send our regular simulator instructor, Dave, because he's got a heart problem. Not this Dave, but another Dave. We want you to go, and then we'll give you the job. So I said, well, when do you want me to go? And they said, well, as soon as possible. I said, well, I'm not going over there. I haven't flown the Hunter for 9 years. And he went, oh. And the squadron were flying out of Boscombe Down because they were redoing the runway at Yeovilton. So I got them over the barrel as well, and they checked me out on the Hunter. I wasn't about to go over there and stick up a simulator and teach people how to fly the Hunter again. So I got checked out, and I went out to Chile, and to be honest with you, it was absolutely fantastic. The pilots were great. You probably all remember in 1970, 71, when the Hunters attacked downtown San Diego, when Allende and that other nasty man took over the country and was killing people. And the Hunters actually attacked in the middle of a city. And I met the pilots that did that when I went there. They were some 10, 14 years before. I met one of the guys that led the first attacking pair that went into San Diego. And what's the name of that town beginning with S? In
Don't know.
Chile. Anyway.
Southampton.
What's that? But
Southampton.
they were fantastic pilots, and we went out into the desert in one two-seater. Because I was a civilian, they were a little bit cagey, some of the senior officers. I thought there was a spy. And at the time, Chile was not in a good place with America. They were a bit worried about Chilean, but they were good, and they loved the English. And anyway, I set up this simulator, got to know the pilots, went out into the desert with them in a Hunter towards the Andes, and these things went up to 20,000 feet, and it was quite amazing flying at 150 feet with your altimeter winding up around 15,000 feet. It was just quite incredible. So that's a picture of a Chilean.
It's not very well marked, is it? It's pretty plain.
No, it could be anything on there. It could be downtown, bloody whatever. But it's definitely a Chilean Hunter, and it was on display as you went into the base on the right. So it's got a camera and so on and so forth. They were quite macho, and I had a bit of a problem not teaching them because they were experienced pilots, some of them. As I say, they'd been attacking in the cities. But they used to come in and fly with their sleeves rolled up, and I used to go down the squadron a lot, obviously, and they'd come down to the simulator with their sleeves halfway up and no gloves and things like that. And I'd had a few things that had happened to me, got burns and things. And I said to the guys, listen guys, you realise that if your heating system on the left-hand side, your flood flow goes off and gets stuck, and you haven't got your sleeves rolled down, you won't be able to operate it, because we had these hot air vents in the Hunter, didn't we, Dave?
Yeah.
And you needed them when you came down from high level to get rid of all the misting. And quite a few people have lost their, aeroplanes by getting misted up. And they all sort of poo-pooed it a bit and thought I was a silly old man. But anyway, one day a guy came in and he sat down in next to the simulator and he said, Rick, it happened. And I said, what? He said, it burst. And I was very badly burned, and his left arm was bandaged. And after that, all the pilots rolled their sleeves down. It was quite remarkable. But anyway, that was Chile.
Brilliant. Right, so on to the next one.
Oh God! Right, this is my wife taxiing out in a Hunter, and it's on the back. It says December the 17th, 2003, 100 years man's first flight, celebration of. And as you'll all remember, I'm sure, well, I was there, when the Wright brothers flew, it was on December the 17th in 1903.
You remember that as well, do you?
Oh, yeah, I remember that. And this is at Kemble in a Hunter with Brian Grant. And I went over to meet a guy who had these Hunters at Kemble. And he was a very, very rich, very, very nice guy in his 40s, early 40s, and he was a chief executive of Shell Oil. And he'd made his money, and he wanted to be a fighter pilot, so he bought himself a Hawker Hunter. And that's the one there on the right, with my wife in it, taxiing out with Brian Grant. On that day, we flew 4 people. When I wanted to get married in a Hawker Hunter with my wife, but the church wouldn't let it. A long story, but anyway, in the end, Brian Grant, I'd come over from Australia where I was flying Hunters without ejection seats that worked. Brian Grant thought I was a bit of a twit, but anyway, he wanted me. I wanted him to fly me in a Hunter and get me checked out in the UK. And to do that, we hired this car, this aeroplane. Off this rich South African, and he allowed us to use his aeroplane. We paid for the fuel. Brian helped me, and he flew his wife, he flew my wife, and then he flew me. And basically they had 15 minutes each at Kemble, and I taxied out after that. The airfield was covered in people with biplanes and automatic things, and every airplane you could imagine was taxiing out at Kemble to get airborne at the time man first flew at Kitty Hawk, and we did it in a Hunter. And I strapped my wife in, let her go. She had an ejection seat, and I gave her the brief on the ejection seat. And she came back absolutely, and she still talks about it now, all these years later.
Not surprised, must have been good. Right, so move on to this, which relates to both of you, really, isn't it?
Yeah, this is my first Squadron. It's, again, a celebration picture taken on it's about something on the August of the 15th, 1965, and it's the 50th anniversary of 20 Squadron, which was in the trenches with Dave Linney at his biplane in 1914, 1915, and 20 Squadron were there along with 6 and a few other squadrons. And I'm second from the right, with my legs apart at the right there, and we flew all those aeroplanes, all 16 of them. There were slightly more than that, but we flew a 16 ship formation, 4 sets of 4 low level across the airfield. Then we did a 16 ship formation, big diamond thing. And then we tried to do a line abreast, not a line abreast, just echelon starboard with 16. But at number 12, which is where I was, it had really started to wobble, and I was going up and down about 15 or 20 feet. So we never managed to do an echelon starboard 16. It was impossible. Yeah, so that's us before we got airborne.
It's good, isn't it? It's a good picture, that one.
Yeah.
Nice one. So we go on to the last ones.
Hunters. Oh,
well, actually, we go on to Dave's, I think.
Dave's, yeah.
That's just a lovely shot. What's the story behind that photograph? Is it just a well-known publicity one, or?
No, there was a station photographer, wasn't there, at
Oh yes.
Yeovilton, who was a real keen lad,
Gosh, he was, wasn't he?
It's great.
we used to
isn't
fly
it?
him quite regularly in the T-Bird, and I don't know which particular sortie this was, but he'd come up to take some pictures, sat in the right-hand seat. I don't know who took this actual picture. It might have been another T8 that he was in.
Yeah.
Anyway, we had a nice sort of echelon Starbrook line abreast.
It just shows off the lines beautifully, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
but
and he said, can you take a picture of the brake? So we got the guys to brake at 1 second
right.
intervals, or a bit less. And
That was the configuration we flew in, wasn't it, Dave? Most of the time, 400s.
yes,
4-100
yeah,
tanks.
4-100. We did start fitting 230s inboard, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
Towards the end.
Yeah.
Yeah, because sometimes the
full.
tanks on aircraft spoil the lines, but it just it suited it so well as well, didn't it? It's
It
really
did.
good.
I think it was the Swiss put 300-gallon tanks on, and they designed a tank which was bigger than our 240 by 60 gallons, and nobody else seemed to get to use those. But you could go a long, long way in the Hunter.
It was a bit,
No in-flight refueling, of course.
no, it was a bit like the 330 ferry tanks we had on the Harrier. I mean,
Yeah.
they're almost as long as a bloody Lancaster.
You
Dwarf
could
the aeroplane.
Yeah, you could get rid of the 100-gallon tanks by just pressing a gang bar up on the left. If you had your 230s on, you had a problem because they were stabilised, as you'll see on this other picture that's coming now, by fixed
Struts, weren't they?
struts, and you were stuck with it. But in fact, if your undercarriage didn't come down or you forgot, it would land on these phenolic tanks, and you stepped out and you went, "Oh, that's funny. Oh, I forgot the gear."
All right, well, moving up to the next picture then.
Okay, this picture is the last time I flew in a Hawker Hunter, and that's in Singapore, and it's VH, which is Australian. FRH, and it's an FR Hunter which belonged to the Singaporeans, and I'm delivering it from it looks at the back, from Rockhampton down to Wollongong Museum, and I wasn't allowed to fly above flight level 235. I had to stay, VMC, Victor Mike. I was restricted all the time I flew in Hunters in the Far East in Australia by the CAA, and I tried not to piss them off, but now and again they made life very difficult. And anyway, this is me on the brake. The aeroplane landed, and that was the last aeroplane I flew. Overall, I flew them for 37 years, from
So what year was that again?
2008.
So what was the last year you flew a Hunter then?
Yeah,
Of course, Fredju.
Fredju, yeah.
Fredju in 85.
85, yeah.
95.
yeah.
95.
Yes.
So.
It looks good with the two tanks as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, it was a lovely aeroplane to fly. It had a big engine in it, and the Hunters went through a series of less thrust up to more thrust, and these were really good. And the Singaporeans, I came up against them. Obviously, my first squadron tour was in Singapore. As this last picture.
Yeah, move over to the last one.
Yeah, and here we have a Hunter with. Ready to go to war, and they'd all been painted up for a very special flight. Again, this was the 50th anniversary of 20 Squadron, and I'm the little bog rat at the back. I've joined 20 in 1964, and we flew along the borders of Borneo in confrontation with the Indonesians. We weren't allowed hot pursuit, so when they came across in their Mustangs and B-25s, we couldn't follow them. There was only one sortie I noticed down here, a special patrol on September the 15th, which is quite an important date for the RAF, and an air marshal came around and told us in Labuan, we were in this little island off the coast of Borneo, we were doing patrols with the javelins from dawn till dusk. We'd do 6 2-hour sorties, so you had to cover that 12 hours from dawn till dusk with 2 fighters, and we would do the first one in the morning, because we had to go underneath the low cloud over the jungles of Borneo with mountains up to 8,000 feet high with these massive 200-foot trees. We wore tree escape systems on our chest underneath our Mae West. They were about 1.5 inches thick.
What's that? So you can escape everything really quickly.
They had 200
You land
feet.
in the top of the tree.
Yeah.
You had 200 feet of nylon in a little aluminium block with a lever. And the idea was if you landed in the trees, which you would do because it was everywhere, you tied one end, the right end, to the tree or your parachute because it couldn't come down. And then you'd slowly squeeze this little block and go down into the jungle and then get killed by a tiger. Anyway, and yes, I remember landing on a pan at Quanton on an exercise called Land Away in Malaya, and there were 2 tigers on the pan as I taxied in at Quanton. 2 tigers on the pan taxiing in on my 21st birthday. Exercise Citadel, and it's a place called Quanton, and then there were just tents there. And it was a 6,000-foot runway, north-south, along the eastern seaboard, just off where the 2 big warships were sunk by the Japanese, Prince of Wales, and you could see them actually from high level when it was smooth. You could see shapes underneath. Anyway, I landed at Quanton at the far end, and taxi was taxiing back towards the tents. And on my right, I had the canopy back, and it was hot, obviously. And I looked ahead, and I thought, what the heck's that? There was a big, long concrete pan with nothing on it, except these creatures on their back rolling around. And I thought, what's big dogs? And as I got alongside them, still with the canopy open, and I must have been about 20 metres away, they were tigers, and they rolled onto their feet, turned their asses towards me, and then just walked towards the jungle. And I closed the canopy thinking, my God, there's tigers here. And then later on I went out there on 74 Squadron, which was a tiger squadron, whatever. And Tiger beer was their most famous beer. So seeing 2 tigers on the pan at Quantum was something I'll always remember.
Bit of a memory, isn't it?
Now this picture again, they've got the rockets on. And the picture was taken from the back of a Beverley. And if you don't know what a Beverley is, it's got a huge door.
It's been mentioned a few times in the podcast.
That's right, cool. It's Keith's favourite aeroplane.
One of them, yeah.
There was this guy with a camera on it, and he was facing out the back.
So you're at stalling speed, no doubt.
Yeah, well, I think we're moving, and we're going past. And he was bucking in to come closer. And I think the guy in the front aeroplane is Dick Smith, and I'm at the back there. Formating, and our rockets. We left the aeroplane after taking some pictures, and it was beautiful quality of the picture, and it's been produced in a few places in magazines. And we then went and fired those rockets on a place called China Rock, just off Changi, and it was our sort of place to go and kill all the seabirds on it, and they'd be there, and we'd fire our rockets at it. So I fired a full salvo of 12. There were 6 on there and 6 on there, and that's what we would have gone to war with the Indonesians, which is our 30mm cannon. So there we go.
Right, so that's our sort of last photo. But what was your favourite mark of the Hunter, and what was it like for a platform for weapons? Was there anything wrong with it, or anything right with it, or anything?
It is the best aeroplane you could possibly have to learn combat manoeuvring and how to. I remember after spending 3 tours on Lightnings, going back to refresh myself on the Hunter, and I forgot about using flap in combat, and they called me 10-second Lee, and I'd been flying them years before, and I'd forgotten how to fight in a telephone booth, which is basically coming to the grips with somebody and turning around the skies. We expect F-16s to do with the Russians and so on. But the Hunter literally was one of the best combat aeroplanes you could possibly have. The engine was very robust. You could slam it backwards and forwards. Not that it's a good idea to do that with any jet engine. It was
apart from the Harrier.
Apart from the Harrier.
Well, you have to.
Yeah. It had everything you needed to learn the basics of a fighter pilot, which is basically to stick, search and report. So you learnt to be a good number 2 before you became a leader, and then after that you led, you followed, or you got the F out of the way. And that's the same now with most combat.
And it felt very natural when you jumped in it, did it? You sort of, when you jumped in, you think, yeah, this feels...
Oh, it always felt right. I mean,
Yeah.
no two cockpits were ever the same.
No.
The switches were scattered
but the
around.
switches did confuse you.
Ergonomic nightmare.
And you know, I've sat in cockpits with glass cockpits, the Hunters, and the Americans turned them into modern fighters, if you like. But the airframe's the same, the ejection seat's the same. You can change the instruments on anything. But the good thing about the Hunter is if that engine quit, you could still get it back. It was hydraulics, but you could use the hydraulics. Below 250, 300 knots, you could still fly it, as I found out with a couple of really frightening sorties where I had control jams and you know, I had to jump out. But apart from that, after takeoff, what they used to do at Fragile and on Squadrons was, not so much on Squadrons, but on Fragile, when you're QFI, you'd take off, you're doing 250 knots, and the guy would just close the throttle. And you're literally a mile off the end of the runway. And you could literally turn, no matter where the wind was, you turn into the wind, you turned round, he then put you in manual, so he'd close a couple of switches, and the aeroplane became really stiff, and you could blow your undercarriage down, you could blow your flaps down, because it had, you know, accumulators to do it in an emergency. This aeroplane was way ahead of its time. And
well, when you look at the sales where they sold it and where it was used, and
27
the time,
countries,
all over the world.
All over the world.
So that's recommendation enough, isn't it?
If there's one thing, and I've got pictures in my book of Phantoms and Harriers and Jaguars. Dave, you know, I've been shot down head on from Harriers and Tornadoes from 20, 30 miles away. But if you mixed it with a Hunter, the best place if you're looking for him is in your mirror, because he'd probably be behind you. And if you've got a 30 millimeter cannons behind you, you ain't going to survive. Because it really was.
That's good firepower.
Amazing firepower for an aeroplane of that age. And
it was a slow rate of fire, by modern standards, wasn't it?
It was a 15-foot gravity drop on air to ground.
Yeah.
But I've dropped all sorts of things off Hunters, you know, and they're a great platform.
And the engines were reliable as well. They were.
The Avon was a fabulous engine, a really good engine. And of course, in reheat, it would go supersonic straight and level if you wanted it to. They just never really developed the Hunter too much, because along came, would you gather, the Lightning? You know? But everybody, you go to war in the Hunters, and they've been in wars, so many wars, in Africa and India and Pakistan. Yeah, I'd have a Hunter in my hangar any day.
Yeah, you both would. I know that.
I think we both said that. Didn't we?
Right. All right. Well, thanks for that. That was interesting. A bit sort of all over the place, but that's why we've done one on the Hunter. So you can listen to Dave and Rick's podcast on their careers, which involves the Hunter. And thanks for listening. Till next time. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.